Hi, I'm Tim Ross, comedian and a big fan of the immensely talented family in tonight's Australian story. At 93, John Olsen is one of Australia's greatest painters. His son Tim is a successful art dealer and daughter Louise runs an iconic design business. But for Tim in particular, growing up in the glare of John's genius was as difficult as it was dazzling. This is the story of one of our great art dynasties.
Oh, that's too red.
You're too red.
Mix it with burnt sienna. It's that tone there, see that?
Yeah, okay.
John Olsen is one of the great survivors of Australian art. He's in the top of the pantheon of our greatest painters. There's no question about that.
The thing is that it's an overview of the landscape, as though we're flying over the top of it, and this dark thing here is a road.
Yeah, art is a river that's run through our family and definitely sort of fed us and looked after us. It runs in our veins.
It's something like writing the landscape. I'm an artist, as a dog is a dog. I didn't choose my profession. It chose me.
My next guest tonight has risen to become one of Australia's leading painters. He painted the 70-foot-long mural in the Sydney Opera House. Ladies and gentlemen, John Olsen.
Everything in his life was at the convenience of his genius, for his genius to be protected, and he was ruthless about that. And he would walk away from a relationship if it meant to preserve better his genius.
Parents can cast a shadow of great light. It's kind of a paradox in a way. Even though he casts great light, for me it became a shadow, that I would never be as interesting as him.
Lisa, lovely to have you. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's good.
Tim as well.
Hi,
Tim,
Lisa. Yeah, nice to see you.
Good to see you. Awesome. We're so excited to have you.
My story is really about any of us who can turn our parents into demigods and then judge yourself against those people and feel it's too unsurmountable.
This is the biggest job I've done since the Opera House.
I saw how Dad was loved so much. I wanted to be loved as much as him. What I found was where I ultimately found my happiness is when I gave up all those ideas of having to compare myself to him.
Tonight, Tim, it's your night. I'm really, really proud that this book is being launched here.
For 6 years, I wore this albatross around my neck of trying to tell my story the best way I could, and it was a struggle.
I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the launch of Tim Olsen's wonderful memoir. It's an insight into the complexities of a father and son relationship. It's an insight into one of Australia's most extraordinary families.
And I was barking up the wrong tree for so many years. I was looking for external gratification.
Art dealer Tim Olsen operates two of Australia's most successful art galleries, and this is Tim and wife Dominic's delightful living room. As you can see, the walls of their home are graced with some truly astounding works, many by Tim's dad, the legendary John Olsen.
The greatest artworks in this house.
Aren't they gorgeous?
I had everything that looked great from the outside. I did have a wonderful wife. I did have a beautiful child. I did have a wonderful business. But I couldn't see it. I was basically powerless over, alcohol and drugs and lots of things.
Hey, senores, hey. Here we go, kid.
I was extremely obese. I was pickled.
Oh, look at that.
I think in many ways Tim medicated himself in that sorrow and that pain through alcohol.
I think the pain probably goes back to how he put so much emphasis on the greatness of his father and made his father big. And I think, as a consequence, perhaps he made himself small.
Would you get another champagne for me, dear? Because I'm feeling the strain of all this cooking.
I never had any notion of how crucially he felt that he was under my shadow.
Cheers.
Cheers, Stevie. Timmy, have you got a drink?
Oh, cheers. How does one become a man whilst having a father who casts a great shadow?
With every addiction, there's underlying trauma. But I don't blame my father for my trauma. My father was never given a handbook on how to be a father because his own father didn't have one either.
John grew up in a house in Newcastle in 1928. There were no books, no music. It was an uncultured childhood.
Dad had a tough childhood at times with a father who was absent, who also suffered terribly from the war and fell into alcoholism.
I began as an artist at age 4, and my mother complaining about me scribbling in her cooking books.
I remember him telling me stories about when he was at school and all he could think about was drawing.
From the beginning, it was a calling. In his puberty and skyrocketing testosterone, he became known as being the best drawer of women's breasts.
I began to be a cartoonist, and I thought, well, I'd like to learn to draw properly. And then I went to Julian Ashton's, and I met all the people that had been waiting for me. It was just a marvellous thing.
The nude I was particularly outstanding at.
He met very intelligent, smart people, savvy people, and it lit a fire in him. And he knew that this was what he was going to become. He was going to become an artist.
I am probably the oldest friend of John Olsen, living, that is to say. There was a pub in Sydney called the Assembly, the habitual watering place for the arty crowd. And when a real artist appeared in the saloon bar of the Assembly in 1956, there was a bit of a stir. Generally, I must say, of envy, because we Australians have very ambivalent feelings about successful people we know. And John Olsen emerged as a person who threatened to become very successful indeed.
My father was married to Mary Flower and they had a daughter, my sister Jane. She was born in the 1950s.
John got a private scholarship in 1957 and he finished up in Spain. John's first marriage to Mary didn't last his scholarship. That marriage dissolved.
When you go abroad, that you think more sort of poignantly about where you come from.
Now, Olsen had come back to give us the Word, and this one was the Word made flesh.
One of John's great masterpieces, painted not long after he returned from Europe, was the Spanish Encounter, which is in the Art Gallery of New South Wales.
Spanish Encounter shocked Sydney with its boldness and childlike abandon.
Dad started teaching at East Sydney Tech, and that's where he met Mum. Mum was one of the students at the college.
My mother just was absolutely smitten by his style and his mind, his verbal capacity, his understanding of art. He was international, he was worldly.
I let lines and colours move around and splotch and dab.
He was a maverick, a debonair maverick.
I want my paintings to have lots of things in them. I don't care if they've got any sort of logical relationship to each other.
Mum was legless. She just fell so deeply in love with this man who was, you know, perpetually fascinating. I was brought up in a way that it was different to a lot of people, which made me feel a bit ashamed. Our house was always full of strange objects and strange ephemera, and now I realise how lucky I was, because without realising it, I was getting a visual education. Well, this is our little humble cottage in Watson's Bay here. It's extraordinary to think that, you know, this was just a little fishing village, and now it's become an elite suburb. To be able to be like a free-range child running around Camp Cove, climbing the rocks, fishing, swimming all summer, and it was so romantic in a way.
I plan to paint for a long time. I think it's our responsibility to take reasonable care of our bodies, particularly when one is on the grog for 30 days and 30 nights.
My mum, Valerie, just loved and adored my dad, and she was very happy in many ways for him to shine.
My mother dedicated her life to bringing Louise and I up, and also keeping Dad's environment right for him to paint. She wasn't interested in money or anything material, and she was a great painter.
To see your father so happy and excited in the studio, and my mum too, to see the joy and sensitivity that was going on in her studio was so inspiring and so intoxicating. I was quite a shy, quiet little girl, but I really observed. My eyes were open. It was always interesting and always full of life and passion.
The house was a place of art, conversations, and so they were brought up in this atmosphere in which that art counted. It was alive.
He is known as a landscape painter, but, you know, the landscape is everywhere. It can be on a table, it can be in a vase, it can be in a face. Everything is a landscape in so many ways.
Probably the greatest help to Clifton Pugh in his search for himself was the arrival of a leading Sydney painter, John Olsen.
How's it going there, Nettie?
John and his family moved to Dunmooch in Melbourne to an artist commune that was run by his friend Clifton Pugh.
It's absolutely crazy in Sydney at the present moment. And I found that the pressures were just too much for me to work.
We really did follow his creative journey, which was great in so many ways. We loved being on that journey, but there were sacrifices around us as a family, and he could be quite ruthless about it and say, come on, pack the bags, let's go.
With their children, Louise and Timothy, John and Valerie Olsen lived in the bush setting for 2 years.
We lived in a little mud brick house with no electricity and no bathroom because he needed to be in that landscape.
And I think they had a fruitful period for him, working with artists, painting and drawing in the bush. Dunmooch was also, you know, a hippie place. There was a lot of free association going on in the sexual love stakes, you know, so I don't know. All I can say is I wish I was there.
It was a lovely painter's life. I mean, there you are in the dried summer grass, and it was truly Australian.
There was a lot of nudity, mad, wild parties on the weekend. It was totally pre-Raphaelite living, you know. I lost my innocence in Dunmooch.
I think success in anything is dangerous. It brings with it all kinds of responsibilities, moral responsibilities, to curb the elephantism of the ego.
My father had won a big prize, and all the other artists in the village were jealous of Dad's national success, winning this big landscape prize. Obviously, the other artists had gone back to their cottages and talked about bloody Olsen winning that prize, you know, and the children had heard. And I was ambushed on the way back from school. I was held down, and one by one they urinated on me, on my face, and I could still taste the ammonia in my mouth from memory. And from that point onwards, I think it's where I lost my faith in friendships, and I felt as though I was almost being punished because of my father.
After Darmuchen, we moved back to Sydney, back to Watson's Bay.
A walk along the beach at Watson's Bay on Sydney Harbour for one of Australia's top painters. He's just received a major commission, the biggest challenge of his career.
All of that has to be rubbed out.
When John was about 44 years old, he was given probably the most important commission of his life to paint murals for the newly created Opera House.
You can hear nearly every ship in the harbour. All are joining in for this tremendous launching ceremony here.
John Olsen no doubt will explain to the Queen that he chose as the theme for the mural the late Kenneth Slessor's poem, 5 Bells, which is a lament for a friend drowned in Sydney Harbour.
Once the Opera House mural happened, all of a sudden there was more attention and more awareness around my dad and his work and the family.
Is it a matter of pride to you that 14 million people have seen this mural?
Oh, of course it is, and in all modesty, it's the best mural ever done in Australia.
My father, because he was the darling of Sydney, he was the darling of Australian art, he went down certain paths where he was impressionable.
You know, you get people ringing up saying, oh, John, can you open this art prize? Oh, John, can you know, as he was being pushed and pulled. There was a lady that started calling him to come and look at her etchings. And eventually he was down at an opening in Victoria and he met Nola Horth. And from there, he started a relationship.
At 52, John had found new inspiration with a young printmaker from Melbourne, Nola Horth. They set up home and studio together in South Australia. He was painting more successfully than ever.
An artist is selfish, that he'll do anything to preserve his work and eliminate anyone who stands in his way. I don't really mean to hurt people either, but my act is only preservation.
When Dad left, suddenly all the lunches stopped. You know, there was always parties, lunches, and it was like the sun had disappeared.
You do what you have to do. And that is sometimes beyond the sense of ordinary morality.
I felt like I had to put my big girl shoes on very quickly at the age of 16 and pull it together for my mother, because she was heartbroken at the time. And I remember going into cafes with her and she'd, cry and I think she had a bit of a nervous breakdown in some ways.
Some like Picasso's blue period best.
He went to Clarendon in South Australia, a beautiful village in the Adelaide Hills, and there he painted some of his most beautiful lyrical paintings. Golden Summer Clarendon and an autumn picture of Clarendon. And he had a very, very good period for his work.
Health, love, and enough, and money, and enough time to enjoy all of it. Yeah.
I think Louise dealt with it better than Tim dealt with it. It hit his core, that sense of suddenly not being that number one or not being thought of. Pretty difficult when we're having dinner at Kinsella's and Tony Bilson comes out and says, oh, I'm just back from Adelaide at your dad's wedding. And Tim and Louise just look at each other, and he just married Nola in Adelaide.
We had long periods of very little communication at that time, and Dad had sort of started up a new life with a new family.
Nola wasn't welcoming, but Dad would still communicate with us. And then we went over and visited. He just wasn't as readily available as he was before.
And I had this feeling that I think you need to be a little thicker there, darling.
I think my father had to put his art first. Some may say, to be a great artist, you have to be a selfish bastard. Dad wasn't selfish. He had to do what he had to do.
The seasons of spring, summer and autumn were painted in this studio. The years passed, but winter remained unresolved.
Everything was going very well until it didn't go well. Because the marriage then broke down, it meant another exit.
When he came back to Sydney after that, it was a wonderful reunion. The sun had come back, the sun had risen again.
For 20 years, painter John Olsen has been making the journey to Lake Eyre.
His method of drawing over the years became more and more natural, like a language, like speaking. It just flowed out of him. He's the painter of our continent. He's traversed it. He's been to the Pilbara, he's been to Northern Australia, been to Western Australia.
But the wonderful thing is, when you look at his work, it could only have come out of Australia.
The thing about his work, it's heavily steeped in the sentiment of landscape, but yet joy, and so full of the love of life.
Really gobsmacked with the sheer scale of it. And one can look to the horizon and the lake is still going. I mean, wow.
Oh my God, there's something really wonderful coming up.
John is such a big spirit, a big personality, and I think Tim idolised him so much and made him so big that perhaps he felt like he could never measure up to that.
I went to art school, but I wanted to find a place in the art world. I was a good painter, good printmaker, I could draw, but I was put off once when my father said, you know, you've either got to be bloody good or forget it. And that kind of resonated. And so the idea of being a painter and always being compared to him terrified me.
How is it possible to measure up against the greatest living artist that Australia has? But it was fortuitous in a way that he stopped being an artist.
I started my first gallery in the early 90s. I found a rightful place in the art world with my gallery.
Tim started being an art dealer because he loves artists and wanted to nurture and support other people's careers in the art world.
There's so many people who still believe that the only reason I've got all this is because of him. It wasn't until I built up a respectable stable that Dad finally said, yes, I'm happy to join you.
We've been open now for several months and everything just gets better and better. And then to be given the most wonderful gift, an exhibition from my father like this. Dad, you don't have to worry about my Christmas present.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How are we?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Quite a few people through the gallery this morning and I've got lots of inquiries.
Tim adores painting and loves painting and truly does get painting in a way.
So I think if we just hang these three together, put this one in the middle, we've all got a lovely relationship to the landscape and that one in particular, you know, from memories of Spain.
I've been very lucky since 2002 that I've been able to have Tim representing me in Australia as my dealer and it's been a wonderful journey where we've both watched each other grow.
You know, he's not trying to be slick or over-sophisticated in his mark making, and as a result, they are sophisticated.
Tim is someone who's prepared to spend the time to look at the work and to understand what that work's for and what that journey's about. Ignited so many careers and also sustained careers.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Edmund Capon. It was John who said, I think, you know, abstract expressionism all looks like alcohol to me. That from a man who really knows what alcohol is.
Art openings were part of the game and to drink a lot was part of the game as well. alcohol was normalised very much in my upbringing. Wine was like water. My father used to put a little trickle of wine in our water as opposed to putting in cordial that my mother didn't like us having. And I'm wondering if that set me up. But unfortunately, I was born with the gene that my grandfathers both had. It's that lovely moment when you've had that first drink, that second drink, and you get this wonderful rush of, you know, feeling like, oh, now I'm myself. Now I feel normal. And as you go along, it's harder and harder to get there. And you end up having to drink more and more. When things get out of control, the enormous amount of shame only fuels the need to drink more.
I met Tim for the first time at a Christmas party. We both went to the party with different partners. I remember thinking, God, he's charming, Tim Olsen. What a charming guy. I thought he was lovely. Neither of us wanted any big wedding or any fuss, so we decided we wanted to elope.
There was just something very elegant about her. She was very unpretentious. She's a woman who's a doer. She really looked after me.
Tim and I both wanted to have children, and we had quite a number of miscarriages. It would have been 8 or 10. That's tough on a relationship too. Plus we had the drinking and the addiction, IVF. It was, you know, it was hard at that time. We were on our last round of IVF and James came along and changed our lives. The birth of James, he was absolutely thrilled, but, you know, part of being so happy was, you know, it was a time to celebrate. And of course, if you're an alcoholic, it's, you know, he was, it just wasn't a good time for him.
I'd wake up sober. I would look at my watch and I'd know what time a certain pub would open. And I'd put James in his baby seat. I'd wind down the window. I'd go and buy him a packet of chips and I'd nick a schooner quickly and whilst watching his little head in the car. You know, I'm just so ashamed of that. You know, that was really... I didn't endanger him to that extent, but that's a terrible way to behave.
The intensity of it is astounding, that you will just destroy everything for this love of this drink. Your marriage, your family, your business, everything. Forget it all. I just need another drink.
It was Christmas morning. Tim had been drinking all night and James was about 3 or 4 and he was opening his toys in the morning.
And I didn't make it to bed and woke up in the living room. There was my little boy shaking me awake, saying, "Daddy, all I want you to do is help me open my presents." That was my abyss. That was my rock bottom. That was the point by which it's so goddamn selfish to live like that, and how pathetic. Really, my rock bottom was my treasure. I love that saying by Joseph Campbell that, you know, in looking for our treasure in life, often we find ourselves in the abyss. Where we stumble, there lies our treasure. The next day, I was on a plane to California to rehab. I got led into a counsellor's office. He looked at me and said, "What's the worst thing that can happen here?" And I said, "Well, you know, I could die." He said, "No, Tim, that would be the best thing because you're such a pain in the ass."
Louise was aware that she was famous vicariously because of her father, but she needed to do it on her own terms.
One small batch. In the design and fashion world, no one knew me so, or knew my family so much. So for me, it was kind of quite liberating.
Oh, yes. John met Catherine and they finished up marrying, and so that was his 4th marriage.
We would have loved to have had a loving relationship with Catherine, but it just wasn't to be. It was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking for all of us.
After Catherine died, An unpleasant family saga developed between John Olsen and his stepdaughter.
The stepdaughter of acclaimed Australian artist John Olsen has denied she unduly influenced her dying mother to obtain $2 million.
The lawyers said, well, are you aware of this transaction? And he had no idea. He was really upset.
It fills me full of sadness that it should have come to that. And in a way, I will never recover from it.
We were now able to be back in our dad's life again.